3 days before Christmas, my phone buzzed while I was standing in line at a coffee shop, clutching a small box of truffles I'd just bought for my coworkers. The message flashed across my screen with that familiar tone that usually meant family chaos. It was from my mother. "Don't come this year, Rachel doesn't want it awkward." Beneath it, a laughing emoji appeared from Rachel, of course. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. Around me, people hummed along to Christmas songs, baristas called out names for peppermint lattes, and the smell of cinnamon hung in the air. But for me, the world had gone silent. I read the message again, slower this time, as if the meaning might somehow change. It didn't. After 8 straight years of planning, cooking, decorating, and paying for our family Christmas gatherings, I had just been uninvited with a single sentence and an emoji. My hand shook as I locked the phone and walked out into the cold Portland air. Snowflakes brushed against my face, but the chill that spread through me had nothing to do with the weather. At 33, I thought I understood my family's brand of dysfunction. I had learned to anticipate the subtle digs, the comparisons to my younger sister Rachel, and the endless guilt trips disguised as love. But this felt like a line I didn't know they would cross. I drove home in silence, my wipers pushing away snow that only seemed to fall harder the longer I stared at the road. My apartment, usually warm and cozy this time of year, felt hollow when I stepped inside. I set the truffle box on the counter and stared at it for a long time before finally whispering to myself, "I guess I'll be spending Christmas alone. I'm an interior architect. I design spaces for people to feel something comfort, peace, belonging. Ironically, I've never managed to build that kind of space for myself. My parents, Richard and Margaret Matthews, were the kind of couple who cared more about appearances than affection. My father used to be a structural engineer before retirement gave him too much time to judge everyone else's choices. My mother was a high school English teacher who once won an award for inspirational teaching. These days, she spends her time curating her perfect suburban life, photo-ready dinners, neighborhood bake-offs, and long Facebook posts about gratitude and family. And then there's Rachel, the golden child. 29, perfectly groomed owner of a boutique flower shop called Bloom by the Lake. She lives in Grandma Helen's old house on Willamette Lake, the one I helped repaint every summer in my teens back, when I still believed family meant teamwork. When Grandma passed away 2 years ago, that house was supposed to be sold and the proceeds split evenly. At least that's what I'd been told. But a few months later, Rachel moved in. Mom brushed it off when I asked, "Your sister just needed a place to get her business started, dear. You wouldn't want her to struggle, would you?" I did what I always do. I stayed quiet and tried to be understanding. That's how I was raised. Be the bigger person, Olivia, my mother would say. Rachel's still learning. The thing is, Rachel never seemed to learn. Every mistake she made somehow became my responsibility. When she maxed out her credit cards, I co-signed a small business loan. When her wedding fell apart 6 months before the ceremony, I was the one comforting her, while our parents called me ungrateful for not being more supportive. I was the glue that held everyone together, and they liked it that way. But glue only holds as long as it isn't cracked. After the text, I made tea I couldn't drink and tried to reason through what had just happened. Maybe they were joking. Maybe it was temporary. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. My mother doesn't joke about appearances, and Rachel doesn't laugh without cruelty behind it. The last time we were together at Thanksgiving, Rachel had complained that my career energy made family gatherings tense. "You always make things so serious," she said. "It's the holidays, Liv. Relax. Relax." I had spent 3 days cooking for 12 people while she brought store-bought cookies and still managed to take credit for the cranberry sauce. I walked to the window, pulling my sweater tighter around me. Portland's December sky was a dim gray, the kind that presses against you. Across the street, a family was stringing lights together, their laughter rising through the air. I watched them for a while, wondering what it must feel like to be part of something uncomplicated. Then my eyes drifted to the old wooden box on my bookshelf, a box that once belonged to Grandma Helen. It was the only thing of hers I'd been allowed to keep. Mom called it sentimental clutter, but to me it was everything. I carried it to the table and ran my fingers over the carvings on its lid. Inside were photos, a few letters, and an old key attached to a faded blue ribbon. I hadn't opened it in over a year. Tonight I did. The scent of cedar drifted up as I lifted the lid. Beneath the letters was an envelope I didn't remember seeing before, sealed with tape yellowed from time. Written in my grandmother's slanted cursive were the words, "For Olivia, open only if you ever feel forgotten." My heart thudded. Forgotten. The word couldn't have been more precise. I peeled the tape carefully and unfolded the contents. Inside was a single piece of paper, creased and slightly smudged but still legible. Across the top it read, "Last Will and Testament, Helen Matthews." My breath caught. I skimmed the paragraphs, my eyes darting over legal language, until one line made me freeze. "I bequeath the property at Willamette Lake to my granddaughter Olivia Matthews." The room tilted. I read it again, slower this time. Olivia Matthews. Not Rachel. Not the family. Me. The edges of the paper trembled between my fingers. It felt impossible. Grandma had left the lake house to me, but I had never been told. My parents had never mentioned it, and Rachel had been living there for nearly 2 years as if it were hers. I pressed my hands against the table, trying to steady myself. Maybe it was a draft, an outdated version. But Grandma Helen wasn't careless. She was the kind of woman who labeled every jar in her pantry and wrote Christmas cards in July. If she'd meant for this to change, she would have said something. A cold realization crept through me. Someone must have known. Someone must have seen this document and chosen to hide it. I could almost hear my mother's voice. "Don't complicate things, dear. The house went to Rachel because it makes sense. But it didn't make sense, not legally, not morally, and certainly not in the way Grandma raised us to believe in fairness." I sat back, the paper still in my hand, and looked around my apartment. The Christmas tree lights flickered in the corner, casting soft patterns across the floor. For the first time, the sight didn't soothe me. All I could think of was the lake house, the creak of the front steps, the way sunlight hit the water in the mornings, the smell of pine wood and apple pie. That house was where I had felt closest to love, to safety, to her. And now I realized it might have been stolen from me. I folded the paper carefully and slipped it back into the envelope, sliding it into my bag. My hands were still trembling, but my mind had gone oddly clear. Maybe they had taken the house? Maybe they thought they could take my place too. But Grandma had always seen me differently. She used to say, "You have my stubborn streak, Liv. It'll either break your heart or save it someday." As I stood there holding the envelope close, I whispered, "Looks like today's the day, Grandma." The clock struck 10. Snow kept falling soft and relentless outside my window. I looked at my phone one more time, the message from Mom still pinned at the top, the laughing emoji from Rachel glowing beneath it. My chest tightened, but I didn't delete it. I wanted to remember that moment. The moment I realized the only way to reclaim what was mine wasn't to beg for a seat at their table, but to build my own. I turned off the tree lights and stood in the quiet, the will burning like a secret in my hand. And for the first time in my life, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like the beginning of something real. The paper lay on my kitchen table all night, the handwriting still looping across the page like Grandma Helen had written it yesterday. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that line again, Olivia Matthews, the property at Willamette Lake. Those words pulsed in my mind like a heartbeat. By morning, the coffee in my cup had gone cold, but my anger hadn't. Because if this was real, then for 2 years my family had been lying straight to my face. The memory that kept replaying in my mind was Christmas last year. The smell of cinnamon candles, the fake smiles, the way my mother beamed while Rachel took credit for everything I'd done. The tree had been covered in gold and white ornaments that I'd picked and paid for, but Mom had introduced them proudly as Rachel's design. Rachel smiled, that effortless smile, pretending modesty while soaking up every compliment. I remember standing near the kitchen door, holding a tray of hors d'oeuvres, thinking how strange it was that no one even asked how I'd managed to pull the whole event together after working 60 hours a week. Mom had raised her glass that night and said, "Here's to our creative Rachel who makes Christmas magical every year." I laughed softly into my drink, the sound bitter. Even Marcus, who'd come with me, looked shocked. He'd squeezed my hand under the table silently, asking if I was okay. I wasn't. But I smiled anyway because that's what I always did, smile, swallow, and move on. After dinner, Rachel had pulled me aside, her voice syrupy sweet. "Liv, Mom and Dad are so happy with how this turned out. Thanks for helping me with the setup." Helping her. Like I was her assistant. I wanted to scream to tell her she hadn't lifted a finger except to post photos online and soak in the praise. Instead I said, "You're welcome," and hated myself for it. My family was built on appearances. We weren't about truth or affection. We were about optics. On social media, the Matthews looked like the perfect suburban clan. Matching sweaters, smiling parents, 2 daughters with shiny hair and good careers. But behind that facade were debts, secrets, and a hierarchy that always kept me one step below. When Dad retired early, he didn't tell me until he needed help paying off a second mortgage. "It's temporary," he'd said. "Family helps family." That line had become a motto in our house, but it really meant Olivia fixes what everyone else breaks. When Rachel opened her flower shop, Bloom by the Lake, Mom called me the next day. "Sweetheart, Rachel's a little short on startup funds. You make good money now. Maybe you can help her out." I sent $12,000 without hesitation. She called it an investment. 2 years later, when I asked if she'd paid it back, Rachel laughed. "Oh, Liv, it was a gift. Don't be weird about money." Weird about money. I thought about that every time I swiped my credit card to help my family in a pinch. Helping was my role, the way Rachel's role was to shine. Mom liked it that way. It kept her image of a perfect family intact. Whenever I tried to talk about how unfair it felt, she'd tilt her head, all sympathy and sugar. "Olivia, you know how sensitive Rachel is. You're the strong one. Don't make her feel small." I used to believe being strong meant staying quiet. But that morning, looking at the will on my table, I realized silence was exactly how they'd stolen everything. Marcus came into the kitchen around 8, rubbing his eyes. "You didn't sleep," he said. I shook my head. "Couldn't. I think my family's been lying to me for years." He picked up the paper, scanning it carefully. "This looks real." "It is real. Grandma was meticulous. If she wrote it, she meant it." He looked at me for a long time, then said quietly, "Then they didn't just lie, they erased you." His words hit harder than I expected. That was exactly it. For years, they'd slowly erased me, my work, my kindness, my presence. I'd let them. After Marcus left for work, I sat at the table staring out the window as Portland's pale winter light filled the room. Across the street, a young couple was carrying a tree into their apartment, laughing as they tried not to drop it. The sight made my throat ache. I used to dream about having Christmases like that, simple, honest, full of laughter that wasn't rehearsed. The truth was, my family didn't love me for who I was. They loved me for what I did for them, and I'd been giving so much for so long that I hadn't noticed how empty it had made me. The phone rang around noon. Mom's voice floated through, soft and polished. "Olivia, honey, how are you?" "Rachel said you got upset about the text yesterday." "Upset?" I said, keeping my tone calm. "No, Mom. I just found it interesting that I'm not welcome at Christmas this year." "Oh, sweetie, don't twist things. It's just been such a tense year. We thought it might be calmer without you there." "Calmer," I repeated. "Right. Because nothing says Christmas spirit like excluding your daughter?" Her voice hardened just slightly. "You're overreacting again. You know how emotional you can get about family matters." That word again. It was her favorite. Every time I caught her in a lie, every time I stood up for myself, she'd label it an overreaction. I could almost hear her rehearsed sigh through the phone. You really should try to be more understanding, Liv. You know how Rachel gets. She just wants peace this year. Peace. They'd stolen a house, erased a will, and uninvited me from Christmas, but sure, Rachel wanted peace. I ended the call before I said something I couldn't take back. The rest of the day, I couldn't stop thinking about Grandma Helen. She was the only one who had ever made me feel seen. Growing up, whenever my parents were too busy or too critical, Grandma would scoop me up for weekends at the lake. We'd bake apple pie, watch storms roll across the water, and talk about everything. "You're my thinker," she used to say, tapping my forehead. "You see what people hide." She'd believed in fairness, absolute old-fashioned fairness. I could still hear her saying, "Family isn't about blood, Liv. It's about who shows up when you need them." But when she passed, it wasn't fairness that showed up. It was greed. At the funeral, I'd noticed small things I didn't want to believe were important. Rachel had worn a black designer dress and spent most of the service whispering to Mom. When I asked about Grandma's will, Mom said briskly, "Everything's being handled by the family trust. Don't worry, dear." Then she'd turned to another relative and started talking about the flower shop's grand opening. That night, when I'd gone to the lake house to collect a few keepsakes, the spare key Grandma had given me was gone. Rachel had said, smiling faintly, "Mom thought it'd be safer if I held onto it." Now, sitting alone in my kitchen, I understood what that moment really was. They hadn't just taken a key. They'd taken ownership of the house of Grandma's memory of my place in this family. I pressed my palms to my face, breathing hard. The anger that filled me wasn't wild anymore. It was quiet, heavy-focused. I wasn't sure what to do yet, but I knew one thing: I wasn't going to let this stay buried. When Marcus came home that evening, he found me spreading old photo albums across the table. "You're doing detective work," he said gently. "Grandma left me clues," I replied. "I just didn't realize it until now." He sat beside me, flipping through a photo of me and Grandma on the lake dock, both of us holding fishing poles. "You look happy here," he said. I whispered. That house was the one place I ever felt like I belonged. Marcus put an arm around me. "Then maybe it's time you take it back." I nodded slowly, staring at the old photos, the laughing faces, the sunlight on the water. Grandma's wrinkled hands resting on mine. Somewhere between those memories and the paper folded in my bag, I felt the first real spark of something new. Not rage, not despair, power. Because if there was one thing Grandma Helen had taught me, it was that truth doesn't vanish just because people cover it with lies. It waits. It waits for the right moment to rise again. And as snow began to fall outside, I realized that moment might finally be coming. The drive out to Willamette Lake felt like driving straight into the past. Snowflakes drifted down in slow spirals, soft against the windshield, but my mind was anything but calm. The road wound through pine forests that looked exactly the same as they had when I was a kid, every bend bringing back a memory I hadn't realized I'd buried. Grandma's laugh. The smell of her apple pie cooling on the windowsill, the creak of the dock under our feet. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, half afraid the memories would hurt more than the truth waiting for me at the end of the road. When the first glimpse of the water came into view, my throat tightened. The lake was still frozen around the edges, mirroring the gray winter sky. And there it was, the house. Grandma's house. Or at least it used to be. I parked on the side of the road and stared at it through the falling snow. The wood panels were freshly painted white, the porch railings gleaming. It looked polished, expensive, lifeless. A sign hung out front in scripted gold lettering, "Bloom by the Lake. Floral Retreat." Rachel had turned our grandmother's home into a business. The home that once smelled of pine wood and cinnamon now probably reeked of candles and synthetic flowers. I sat in the car for a long minute, trying to decide if I had the strength to get out. When I finally stepped onto the icy ground, my boots crunched in the snow. I could almost hear Grandma's voice scolding me gently, "Careful on those steps, Liv. They've got a slick personality." I smiled in spite of myself, even as my chest ached. The front door was decorated with a massive wreath of white roses and glittering ornaments, Rachel's touch overly perfect, devoid of soul. I walked up the porch steps, my breath fogging the air. Through the window, I could see women inside arranging bouquets and laughing. None of them knew that every inch of this place had been built by the hands of someone who loved it, not someone who branded it. A young woman in an apron opened the door, cheerful. "Hi there. Are you here for the floral class?" I shook my head. "No, I built this porch when I was 10. Her smile faltered. "Oh, you must be family." "I was," I said quietly, and turned back toward the lake. The dock was still there, half covered in snow, the wood grayer than I remembered. I walked to the end of it, the boards groaning under my weight. The wind off the lake was sharp, but standing there, I could almost feel Grandma beside me again, her hand resting on my shoulder, warm and steady. "Love means showing up when others don't," she used to say. She said it the night my parents forgot to pick me up from a school play, and she drove all the way across town in her robe just to bring me home. She said it every time I doubted myself. And she said it one summer evening sitting right here on this dock when I asked her who would get the lake house someday. "You sweetheart," she'd said, "because you're the only one who loves it for what it is, not for what it's worth." At the time, I hadn't understood why she'd said it like a secret, or why her voice had that edge of finality. Now I did. She'd known how my family thought. She'd known what they'd do. The air stung my face, and I realized I was crying without meaning to. I wiped the tears quickly, angry at myself for giving them more power than they deserved. I turned around and looked at the house again. Rachel's white SUV was parked out front, spotless even in the slush. She wasn't there today. She'd posted on Instagram earlier about a holiday weekend getaway. Typical. Leave the hard work to others, show up only for the applause. I walked around the back of the property. The garden beds where Grandma used to grow wild lavender were gone, replaced by symmetrical stone planters filled with imported evergreens. The rocking chairs on the porch were gone too. Everything that had been hers was erased, repainted, or repurposed. Standing there, I felt the years collapse, the summers when Grandma taught me to hammer nails, the afternoons painting shutters together, the nights sitting by the fire, while she told stories about growing up during the Depression. We didn't have much live, she'd said once, but what we had we protected. I hadn't protected this. I drove to Salem that afternoon to see Aunt Linda, my mother's younger sister. She was the only one who'd stayed close to Grandma near the end. Her house smelled like old books and lavender tea, and seeing her face, warm, kind, a little surprised, made something in my chest unclench. "Olivia," she said, opening the door wider. "Well, if this isn't a Christmas miracle." I smiled faintly. "Hi, Aunt Linda. I needed to ask you something about Grandma." Her brow furrowed. "Oh, honey, come in. Sit. You look like you've seen a ghost." I sat at her kitchen table, the one cluttered with knitting supplies and half-finished puzzles. The smell of vanilla filled the air. It felt safe here, which made what I had to ask feel even heavier. "Did Grandma ever talk to you about her will?" I asked quietly. Linda's knitting needles stopped mid-air. She looked up slowly, studying my face. "Why do you ask?" I took the folded paper from my bag and placed it on the table. "Because I found this." She adjusted her glasses and read silently. Her eyes widened, then filled with something like guilt. "Oh, Olivia, please," I said, my voice tight. "Tell me the truth." Linda set the paper down and clasped my hand. "Your grandmother was clear about what she wanted. She told me you were the one who loved that house. She said she'd made it official in writing. But after she passed, your mother said the documents were lost. She said Helen changed her mind." My stomach twisted. "And you believed her?" Linda looked away. I wanted to. Margaret always had a way of making things sound reasonable. And Rachel was struggling, so I thought, maybe Helen did change her plans. But when I saw you at the funeral, I knew something was wrong. You looked like someone who'd been shut out of her own life. The words hit me like a physical blow. "They knew," I whispered. "They knew the house was mine." Linda nodded slowly. "Your mother was the executor. She handled everything." And then Rachel moved in almost immediately. I told myself not to meddle, But Helen would never have wanted it this way. I leaned back in my chair, my mind spinning. Do you think Grandma suspected they'd do this? She wasn't naive, Linda said softly. She loved your mother, but she knew Margaret cared too much about how things looked. She told me once, appearances will be the death of that woman's conscience. Something between a laugh and a sob escaped my throat. That sounds exactly like her. Linda reached into a drawer and pulled out a small envelope. I wasn't sure when to give you this. Maybe now's the time. Inside was a photo Grandma and me standing on the dock sunlight and our hair, our hands clasped. On the back in her handwriting was a single line. Don't let them make you small. I stared at it until the letters blurred. She knew this would happen. She probably did, Linda said. But she also knew you'd be strong enough to handle it. Driving back to Portland, the world outside my windshield looked sharper somehow. The snow seemed brighter, the air colder. Every mile I covered felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I hadn't realized I'd lost. When I finally reached my apartment, I spread the will, the photo, and the letter on my table like puzzle pieces. The truth wasn't blurry anymore. It was right there in front of me, printed in black ink and written in Grandma's hand. I looked out the window, the city glowing beneath the winter sky. For the first time, I didn't feel powerless. I didn't even feel angry. I just felt awake. Maybe they had taken what was mine. Maybe they'd built their perfect life on top of a lie. But that didn't make it theirs. I turned off the lights, leaving only the glow of the Christmas tree. The paper sat on the table behind me, the name Olivia Matthews catching the flicker of gold. They thought they could erase me, but Grandma was right. I was written in ink. And ink doesn't fade. Marcus stared at the papers spread across my dining table like they were evidence from a crime scene, which in a way they were. The will, the letter from Grandma, the photograph, every piece fit together too perfectly. He didn't say anything for a long time. Finally, he looked up at me. You know this isn't just emotional, right? This is legal. They forged documents live. I nodded my fingers, tracing the edge of the paper. I know. I just don't know how far I'm willing to go yet. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. You don't owe them protection. They didn't protect you. I looked at him, the words settling heavy between us. I'd spent my entire life protecting people who wouldn't hesitate to throw me under the bus for convenience. Mom used to say I was the stabilizer of the family. That meant I was the one who kept things from falling apart while everyone else set the fires. I need to know exactly what they did, I said. If they used Grandma's name to transfer the deed, there'll be records. Marcus reached for his phone. Then, let's find out. He spent the next hour researching property records while I sat frozen in my chair, my stomach churning. When he finally looked up, his expression told me everything. The title was transferred 6 months after Helen's death, he said. Executor Margaret Matthews. Beneficiary Rachel Bloom. Rachel had even changed her last name to make her business sound prettier. I took the laptop from him and scrolled through the official document. Grandma's signature looked right, except it wasn't. I knew her handwriting as well as my own. She'd written me letters every birthday until she died, and her capital H always had a loop. This one didn't. I felt cold all over. They forged her name, I whispered. Marcus leaned back. This isn't just fraud, Olivia. It's criminal. The word hung in the air, heavy and surreal. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. My own mother had broken the law. My sister had benefited from it. And both of them had smiled at me through years of holidays, as if nothing had happened. I closed the laptop slowly. I need to talk to someone who knows what to do with this. I took a breath. A lawyer. Marcus nodded. I know someone. Sarah Levine. She's worked with estate disputes before. That night I barely slept. I kept thinking about Grandma's voice, the way she'd hum, while stirring sugar into her tea, the warmth of her hand when she'd say, "You're my girl, Liv." The thought that my mother and sister had erased that, stolen it for profit, made my chest ache with a fury I didn't know how to contain. The next morning, Marcus drove me downtown to meet Sarah. Her office overlooked the Willamette River, modern and minimal, all glass and soft gray furniture. She greeted me with a firm handshake and kind eyes. "Marcus told me a bit about what's going on," she said, "but I'd like to hear it from you." I laid out everything: the will, the photo, the letter, the story of Rachel moving into the house, and the suspicious signature. Sarah listened carefully, taking notes, her face unreadable. When I finished, she folded her hands together. "Olivia, what your family did isn't uncommon. It's called inheritance fraud. It happens when an executor manipulates or falsifies documents for personal gain. Can it be undone?" I asked quietly. She nodded. "If you have evidence and you do, it can. But it will be messy. You'll need to decide if you're ready for that." Messy. The word didn't scare me anymore. I'd already lived through their mess. Sarah examined the signature. "You're right. This looks altered. We can request handwriting verification, and I'll need to see the official transfer forms." She leaned forward. "Do you want to pursue this privately or publicly?" I hesitated. "Privately for now. I'm not looking for revenge. I just want the truth to be official." Her mouth twitched in a faint smile. Revenge and truth have a funny way of overlapping. When I left the office, the clouds had cleared, and sunlight glinted off the river. It was cold, but for the first time in weeks I felt warm inside. I had a plan. Over the next few days, I gathered everything Sarah asked for: emails, photos, old bank statements. Marcus helped me track down archived property records and notarized documents. The deeper we dug, the uglier it got. There were bank transfers labeled home repair that matched withdrawals from my mother's account. A business grant Rachel received that listed Bloom by the Lake as operating from her inherited family home. I printed every page, stapled every receipt. Each one felt like proof that my grandmother's trust had been betrayed. By December 22nd, Sarah called with confirmation. "We have enough," she said. "I filed the preliminary claim. They'll be notified within 10 days. 10 days, that meant after Christmas. I almost laughed at the irony. My mother had uninvited me to her holiday celebration 3 days before the very one that would blow their perfect world apart. That evening, I sat on my couch staring at the tree I hadn't decorated. The lights blinked slowly, steady and patient. Marcus sat beside me, his hand warm on mine. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "I'm not sure," I said honestly. "It's strange. I thought getting justice would feel louder. But it feels quiet." He nodded. "That's peace trying to come back." I smiled faintly. "Peace. I don't even know what that feels like anymore." "You will," he said softly. "You're closer than you think." Later that night, I found myself scrolling through Rachel's social media again. She'd posted a photo from the lake house, her in front of the fireplace, surrounded by white roses and champagne bottles. The caption read, "Grateful for family success and new beginnings." My fingers hovered over the comment section. For a brief, dangerous moment, I wanted to post the photo of Grandma's will right there, to let the world see the truth. But I stopped. Not yet. There would be a right moment, and when it came, it would hit harder than any comment could. The next morning, I woke to another text from Mom. "Don't forget we're keeping things small this year. Rachel's hosting. Please don't make this about old grudges. Be mature. Be mature." As if stealing a house wasn't childish. I stared at the message, then put my phone face down. For once, I didn't feel the urge to defend myself. They could think whatever they wanted. The truth didn't need my permission to exist anymore. It was already alive and moving quietly but inevitably toward them. That afternoon, Marcus came home with a small gift bag. "Early Christmas present," he said, handing it to me. Inside was a keychain with a tiny silver house charm. "For when you get your home back." I laughed softly, my eyes burning. "You really think I will?" he smiled. "I don't think, I know." When he left for work, I placed the charm beside Grandma's old key on my nightstand. The two glinted together in the light, past and future side by side. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the city in white silence, and for the first time I didn't see it as cold. I saw it as a blank page, because I wasn't the quiet daughter anymore. I wasn't the one holding everything together. I was the one about to turn the story upside down. 2 days before Christmas, my mother's number flashed across my phone screen again. I almost didn't answer. The last few times we'd spoken, her voice had been dipped in sugar but laced with poison. Still, old habits die hard. I picked up. "Olivia," she said, her tone too bright. "I just wanted to check in. You've been quiet lately." I let out a slow breath. "You told me not to come to Christmas, Mom." "What exactly did you expect me to say?" She laughed softly, the kind of laugh that always meant she was trying to control the conversation. "Oh, darling, you're taking that the wrong way. Rachel just wanted to avoid any tension this year. You know how emotional she gets." "Tension," I repeated. "That's one way to describe forgery." There was a pause too long to be casual. Then her voice sharpened. "What are you talking about? I think you know," I said evenly. "I found Grandma's will." The silence on the line stretched so long that I could hear her breath hitch. Then came the denial. "That old document, Olivia, she changed it." "I told you that. The final version left the house to Rachel." "No, the final version was the one she signed," I said. "And I have it. The ink's faded, but her signature isn't." Her voice broke into a brittle laugh. "You're being ridiculous. Do you have any idea what you're accusing us of?" "Yes," I said softly. "For the first time, I actually do." I could hear her inhale sharply. "This is not how family treats family." I almost smiled. "No, Mom, but it's exactly how you treat me." I ended the call before she could speak again. My hands were trembling not from fear, but from something cleaner, sharper freedom. For the first time, I'd spoken to her without shrinking. I went to the window. The city was wrapped in snow streetlights, glowing like halos. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang. It should have felt like Christmas, but it didn't. It felt like justice waiting to happen. That night, Marcus made pasta, while I sat on the couch, sorting through the stack of papers from Sarah. The legal process was in motion now, quiet but unstoppable. "You okay?" he asked, setting a bowl in front of me. "Not sure," I said. I told her. About the will. He looked at me carefully. And she panicked. Tried to gaslight me, same as always. Marcus leaned back, crossing his arms. "That means she knows she's guilty." I nodded. "She does, but she still thinks she can control the narrative. She always has." He reached across the table and took my hand. "You've already changed it." I wanted to believe that. The next morning, a new text came through, this time from Rachel. "You really need to stop digging, Liv. You're making a fool of yourself." I stared at the message for a long time before typing back. "Funny," I thought, "that's what you've been doing for 2 years with my house." Her reply came instantly. "It's not your house. Grandma told Mom she wanted me to have it. You were too busy with your career to care." I laughed out loud. The projection was almost impressive. If that's true, why did Mom forge her signature? 3 dots blinked on my screen for a long moment before disappearing. She didn't respond again. The truth about Rachel was simple. She was addicted to being the favorite. Growing up, she learned early that if she smiled and played helpless, Mom would swoop in to fix everything. I was the one cleaning up behind them, helping with homework, baking the birthday cakes, paying for the emergencies once we were adults. I was the invisible scaffolding that held their perfect world upright. When Grandma passed, that scaffolding became a threat. My presence reminded them of what they'd taken. So they erased me one small act at a time until I was gone completely. But not anymore. By mid-afternoon, my phone started buzzing again. Mom called, then Dad, then Rachel. I ignored them all. The text that followed came in a wave. "We need to talk, Liv. Don't make this worse. You don't understand how inheritance law works. Grandma wanted peace, not fighting. You're overreacting again." I scrolled through each one calmly, my pulse steady. It was strange how quickly fear could turn into focus. For years, I'd been conditioned to flinch every time they accused me of being dramatic. Now it just sounded like desperation. By evening, Marcus and I were at Sarah's office again, signing the formal filing. Once this is submitted, she said, it becomes public record. They'll receive notice after Christmas. Be ready for backlash. I smiled faintly. They've been giving me backlash my whole life. I can handle a few more days. Sarah handed me a copy of the document. Seeing my name, Olivia Matthews Claimant, in bold letters made something inside me settle, like a door closing behind years of self-doubt. That night I dreamed of the lake, only this time it wasn't Rachel's showroom or Mom's pride project. It was mine again. The water was calm, and Grandma was sitting on the porch, swing her hands folded in her lap. "You did it, sweetheart," she said. "You remembered who you are." When I woke, there were tears on my pillow. The next day, December 23rd, my father showed up unannounced. I saw his car from the window and almost didn't open the door, but Marcus was at work, and something in me wanted to face this head-on. Dad stood there holding a grocery bag. "Brought cookies," he said awkwardly. I raised an eyebrow. "Since when do you bake?" he sighed. "Your mother made them." "She's upset, Olivia. You blindsided her." I stepped aside just enough for him to enter, though the air between us was stiff. "I didn't blindside anyone. I uncovered what you both did." He looked tired, older than I remembered. "You don't understand, Liv. Your mother thought she was doing what was best for the family. By stealing from me," he flinched. "She never meant it like that." "How else could she have meant it?" I asked, voice rising. "Grandma trusted her, and she betrayed that. And you stood by and let it happen." He rubbed his temples. "You've always been so black and white. Life isn't that simple. It's simple enough when someone forges a legal document." He dropped the bag onto the counter, his voice low. "You're going to destroy this family." I laughed softly. "Dad, you already did." He turned toward the door. "You'll regret this," he said, but there wasn't conviction in his tone, just fatigue. When the door shut, I felt something strange. Not guilt, not victory, just relief. That night, I called Aunt Linda. "They know," I said. She sighed on the other end. "I'm not surprised. Margaret always thought consequences were optional. I think she's about to find out they're not." Linda chuckled softly. "You sound like Helen." I smiled at that. That's the best compliment I've ever gotten. As the snow fell outside, I sat by the window, the city lights flickering below. The streets were quiet, the kind of calm that only comes right before a storm. In 48 hours, the entire Matthews family would gather at the lake house, pretending everything was perfect. They'd laugh, take photos, post their curated happiness online, and I'd be nowhere near it by their choice. But they didn't know that I'd already chosen my own kind of presence. Because some truths don't need to be spoken in person, they only need to be shown, and I had something to show them. December 24th arrived gray and silent, the kind of winter morning where the air feels thick enough to cut. I woke up before sunrise, long before the city stirred, and stood by the window watching snow drift across the rooftops. The world looked peaceful, but peace felt like a language I hadn't spoken in years. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with Grandma's will spread out in front of me again. The paper was starting to curl at the edges from how many times I'd unfolded it. I traced her signature with my fingertip, remembering the way her hand used to shake slightly when she wrote, but never enough to ruin her perfect loops. It wasn't just ink, it was her voice, her proof, her final truth. By 8, Marcus was up, moving quietly around the kitchen. He knew better than to fill the silence with small talk. Finally, he placed a cup of coffee in front of me and said, "You don't have to look at that again, you know." "I do," I said softly, "because tomorrow they'll be smiling in that house, and every inch of it is built on this lie." He sat across from me. "So what are you going to do?" I stared out the window for a long time before answering. "Something that will make them remember what honesty feels like." He tilted his head. "You've got that look." "What look?" "The one you get when you're about to turn a quiet storm into a hurricane." I almost smiled. "Then let's hope this one washes everything clean." I spent the rest of the morning organizing every piece of evidence I had. Copies of the will, the property records, the letter from Aunt Linda. Sarah had emailed me the certified verification documents the night before, confirming that Grandma's signature was real and the one on the transfer was fake. I printed everything, slipping it into a single folder labeled Helen's Truth. Marcus watched from the couch as I moved around the apartment with a strange calm. "You really are your grandmother's granddaughter," he said finally. "Good," I said. "Because she's the only person in that family who ever fought fair." By noon the text started coming again. Rachel first. "We're doing dinner at 6. Hope you find some peace this holiday." The audacity almost made me laugh. 10 minutes later, Mom followed. "I hope you're not planning to make any more trouble, Olivia. Family is about forgiveness, not revenge." I typed back, "Forgiveness requires honesty first." Then, I turned off my phone. That afternoon, Marcus went out to finish some errands and I was alone. The apartment felt heavy with anticipation. I pulled Grandma's wooden box from the shelf and opened it one more time. Inside, next to her letters, was the small silver key she'd left me. I ran my thumb over it. "You said this would always lead me home," I whispered. "Maybe it's time to see if you were right." I slipped the key into my coat pocket. Outside, the snow had thickened, covering the city in soft white silence. I got into my car and began the drive toward Willamette Lake. The roads were slick but familiar. Every mile brought me closer to the place where everything had started and where everything would finally end. By the time I reached the lake, the sun was low, and the air had that metallic stillness that comes just before nightfall. The house stood exactly as I remembered it, polished, perfect, and hollow. Lights glowed warmly through the windows. I could hear faint laughter inside. I parked far enough away that no one would see my car and walked up to the edge of the property. Through the window, I saw Rachel by the fireplace, her blonde hair perfectly curled, a glass of champagne in her hand. Mom was at the table arranging candles. Dad was pouring wine, pretending nothing had ever been broken. For a moment, I almost pitied them, their entire lives built on a performance. Then I pulled out my phone, opened the camera, and took a photo of the house glowing gold in the fading light. I opened the gallery app and added the image to the folder with Grandma's will. The pieces were complete now. I didn't knock. I didn't walk inside. I didn't need to. The house wasn't my stage, it was my evidence. I turned and walked back to the car. When I got home, Marcus was waiting by the window. "You went there," he said, not a question. "I did," I said. "They're having their perfect Christmas Eve." He crossed his arms. "And you, I'm preparing a better one." He watched me pull out my laptop and sit down at the table. I opened the family group chat, the one where I'd been uninvited just 3 days ago. The last message still sat there, glowing on the screen. "Don't come this year. Rachel doesn't want it awkward." Beneath it, that laughing emoji. I took a deep breath and whispered, "Let's see who's laughing now." I uploaded the photo I'd taken of the house, followed by a scanned image of Grandma's will, the official document with her signature clear and undeniable. Then I added the legal verification certificate Sarah had sent me. At the bottom, I typed one simple line, "Merry Christmas from Grandma Helen." For those who forgot her handwriting. My finger hovered over send. Marcus came up behind me, resting a hand on my shoulder. "You sure?" he asked quietly. I nodded. "Completely." The moment I pressed the button, the message appeared at the top of the chat. I watched the little read receipts pop up one by one. Seen by Mom. Seen by Dad. Seen by Rachel. The typing bubbles appeared, then vanished. No one responded. Marcus exhaled. "Well," he said, "that's one way to say Merry Christmas." I leaned back in the chair, staring at the phone in silence. They'll spend the rest of the night trying to figure out how to spin this. But for the first time, they'll have to do it without me. The snow outside had stopped falling. The city was still caught between dusk and dark. I felt an unfamiliar calm wash over me, a strange mixture of exhaustion and release. Later, while Marcus made tea, my phone lit up again. A private message from Rachel. "How could you? You've ruined everything." I typed back, "No, Rachel, I just stopped pretending everything wasn't already ruined. Then I turned the phone off. We sat by the window sipping tea in the quiet. The streetlights shimmered against the snow, and for once I didn't feel excluded from the season. I felt free. I thought of Grandma Helen then, of her soft voice, and her fierce sense of fairness. If they ever try to erase you, she'd told me once, remind them you were written in ink, not pencil. Tonight, I'd done exactly that. Marcus handed me a blanket and smiled. "You look lighter," he said. "I feel lighter." "Think they'll call?" "Oh, they'll call," I said. "And when they do, they'll finally know what it feels like to be silent." Outside, a church bell rang somewhere in the distance. Midnight was close. The world was quiet, blanketed in white. I rested my head on Marcus's shoulder and whispered, "Merry Christmas, Grandma. I kept your promise." And for the first time in years, I didn't feel forgotten. I felt seen. The sound of my phone buzzing pulled me out of a dream I couldn't quite remember. I blinked against the dim morning light, the room still heavy with the scent of cinnamon and pine from the candle Marcus had lit the night before. It took me a second to realize what day it was. Christmas Eve. The day everything would finally fall apart for them. My phone wouldn't stop vibrating. The screen was glowing with messages stacked one on top of another. The family group chat. "Mom, what is this, Rachel? Tell me this is some kind of joke. Dad, we need to talk, right now." I stared at the screen, silent. Beneath their frantic messages was the one I'd sent last night, the photo of the house, Grandma's will, and those 7 words, "Merry Christmas," from Grandma Helen. For those who forgot her handwriting, they'd seen it. Every single one of them. Marcus stirred beside me. "You okay?" I nodded, but my voice came out thin. "They saw it." He sat up, running a hand through his hair. "And now they're panicking." I opened one of the messages. Mom had followed up again. "You've misunderstood everything. You're making a scene for no reason. Please delete that post." Another from Rachel came seconds later. "You're sick, Liv. How could you humiliate me like this?" I let out a slow, quiet breath. "They're not denying it," I said. Marcus leaned over, reading the messages. "Of course not. They're just trying to control the damage." I got out of bed, pulling on my sweater. My hands were shaking, not from fear this time, but from something that felt dangerously close to power. I think it's time to stop letting them. By the time I made coffee, my phone was ringing again. "Mom." I hit ignore. It rang again. Then Rachel. Then Dad. They must have been sitting in that perfect lake house, watching their world tilt, trying to decide who would talk first. I finally picked up on the 4th call. Mom's voice came through, tight, trembling, but still trying to sound composed. "Olivia, what have you done?" "I told the truth," I said. "You don't know what you're talking about," she snapped. "That document means nothing. It's an old draft. Sarah had it verified," I interrupted. "It's real. Grandma's signature, the legal seal, everything checks out." "You lied, Mom. You and Rachel both." She was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was lower, colder. "You're destroying this family. Is that what you wanted for Christmas?" "No," I said softly. "What I wanted was a family that didn't destroy me first." Her breath hitched. "You're being dramatic again. Everything you do has to be a performance." "Maybe," I said, "but at least my performance is honest." I hung up. The silence that followed was like air after a storm, thin but alive. Marcus came into the kitchen, handing me a mug. "You good?" I smiled faintly. "Better than I've been in years." Around noon, the messages started flooding in again, this time from relatives I hadn't heard from in months. A cousin texted, "Is it true about the will?" An aunt messaged, "Your mom's losing it." "Everyone's talking about what you posted." I scrolled through each one, my pulse steady. They weren't on my side, they were curious. Family drama was bloodsport in the Matthews clan. But curiosity was fine. Curiosity meant exposure. By early afternoon, Sarah called. "You lit a fire," she said, her tone equal parts impressed and cautious. "They've probably already contacted an attorney, but don't worry. What you did wasn't illegal. Unwise maybe, but not illegal." "Good," I said. Because it felt right. Sarah paused. I have to ask Olivia, what are you hoping for? What do you want to come out of this? I thought about it for a moment. I want them to look at me and finally see the truth they've been avoiding. And I want my grandmother's name to mean something again. That's a start, Sarah said. Just remember, people like them don't crumble all at once. They unravel. By evening, the unraveling had begun. The first sign came in the form of a text from Dad. You could have talked to me before doing something so drastic. You're better than this. I almost laughed. Better than honesty, I muttered under my breath. Then Rachel sent a picture, one I didn't expect. It was a screenshot of a group chat between her mom and Dad. The caption read, "You want honesty? Fine." The messages in the screenshot made my stomach twist. Mom, we'll tell her it was an old draft. Rachel. She won't buy it. She's not stupid, Dad. Then we stick to the story. No one needs to know how the signature was handled. Mom, we can't afford another scandal. Just keep smiling until this blows over. I felt my chest tighten. Marcus looked over my shoulder at the screen. They're panicking, he said. Yeah, I said, my voice shaking. But now they're leaving a trail. The phone buzzed again. Another text from Rachel. Delete everything, Liv. If you don't, you'll regret it. I typed back. The only thing I regret is not finding out sooner. And then I blocked her. The night came slowly stretching across the city like a dark curtain. Marcus ordered Chinese takeout while I sat by the window watching the snow fall. My phone was quiet now, completely silent. That more than anything told me they were regrouping. At 8:30, I got a call from an unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. A familiar voice came through Dad's, but lower, tired. Olivia, please listen to me. Your mother's not well. This is hurting her. She wasn't sick when she stole from me, I said. He sighed. We made mistakes, okay, but dragging this into the open won't fix anything. You've made your point. Have I? Yes, he said. Everyone knows you're angry. You've humiliated your sister and your mother. What more do you want? I stared at the reflection of the snow in the glass. For once, I said, I want to stop being the one who gets humiliated. He didn't answer. The silence stretched, and then he said quietly, You sound just like Helen. Thank you, I said, and hung up. After that, I turned off my phone completely. I didn't want to hear them anymore. Their words had always been weapons disguised as conversations. I wanted silence, real silence, not the kind they'd forced on me all my life. Marcus handed me a fortune cookie with dinner. I cracked it open absently. Inside, the paper read, You will reclaim something you lost long ago. I stared at it for a long time, then slipped it into Grandma's wooden box. By midnight, snow had buried the streets. From our window, I could see the faint shimmer of holiday lights in the neighboring apartments. Families gathered around fireplaces, laughter floating through the air. For the first time, I didn't feel envy. I felt stillness. Marcus came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist. You did the hard part, he whispered. Not yet, I said softly. Tomorrow they'll wake up pretending it's a perfect Christmas, but the truth doesn't go away when the lights go out. He kissed the top of my head. So what happens now? I looked out at the snow, my reflection faint in the window. Now, I said, they live with what they've built, and I start building something new. Outside, the church bells rang again, soft, distant, echoing across the frozen city. I watched the flakes swirl under the streetlight, glowing like tiny sparks. Grandma used to say Christmas Eve was the moment the world paused to listen. Tonight, I finally understood what she meant. Because the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was mine. The morning light cut through the curtains in thin gold lines, painting my living room with the kind of peace that felt almost dishonest. My phone was off. My laptop was closed. The world outside was white and quiet. But inside me, something sharp and deliberate had settled overnight. Marcus was still asleep when I slipped out of bed, wrapped myself in a sweater, and sat down at the table with a cup of coffee. The air smelled like cinnamon and pine from the candle that had burned too long the night before. The only sound was the clock ticking steady and relentless. Each second was one beat closer to what I had planned for tonight. I opened the folder marked Helen's Truth again. The will, the verification documents, and the photo of the lake house, all there crisp and clean. I'd already done the damage by sending the photo to the group chat, but that was just the surface. Now it was time to make it official. Not for revenge, not even for justice anymore, but for closure. At 10, I called Sarah. She answered on the first ring. "You ready?" she asked. "More than ready. Good. I'm filing the full motion today." Once it's stamped by the clerk, the notice goes out to the Matthews family within 48 hours. "Perfect," I said. "Make sure the verification documents are attached. No room for denial." "You'll get your copy by noon," she replied. "Olivia, I need to say something. What you're doing, it's brave, but it's going to get loud." I smiled faintly. "Let it." After hanging up, I sat there for a moment, staring at the steam curling off my coffee. It struck me that for the first time in years, I wasn't scared of being the one who made noise. I wasn't the quiet one anymore. When Marcus came out of the bedroom, his hair still messy, he leaned against the doorway and studied me. "You look calm," he said. "I am," I said. "I've been waiting for this kind of calm my whole life." He crossed the room, kissed the top of my head, and murmured, "Then whatever happens today, you've already won." We spent most of the afternoon running errands, buying groceries, picking up gifts for friends, pretending like it was just another Christmas Eve. But every now and then, I caught my reflection in a shop window and didn't quite recognize myself. My eyes looked different. Focused. Certain. Around 4, my phone buzzed with an email notification. From Sarah Levine, subject filed and verified. My stomach flipped as I opened it. The document was stamped, signed, and official. The state now recognized me as the rightful heir to Helen Matthews' estate. It was done. I forwarded the document to my personal email, printed 2 copies, and slipped them into the envelope marked "To the Matthews family." On the front, I wrote in clean block letters, "Truth doesn't need permission." Marcus watched me seal it. "When are you sending it tonight?" I said. "When they're all sitting around that perfect dinner table pretending nothing's wrong." He nodded slowly. "You know this won't just end there, right?" "I don't want it to end," I said. "I just want it to be real." The drive to the lake that evening was quiet. Snow had stopped falling, and the world outside glowed under a cold metallic light. The closer we got, the tighter my chest felt. Marcus reached over and squeezed my hand. "You don't have to go inside," he said. "I know," I whispered. "I just need to see it one more time." When the house came into view, it looked like something out of a holiday card, lights strung perfectly along the porch. The wreath on the door, a fire flickering behind the window. Through the glass, I could see Rachel's silhouette, her hand resting dramatically on a champagne flute. Mom was beside her, fussing over a tray of food. Dad hovered by the tree, still trying to look like the peacemaker. I pulled the envelope from my coat pocket. "Ready?" I asked. Marcus nodded. "You want me to come with you?" I shook my head. "This part's mine." I walked up the path, my boots crunching in the snow. The closer I got, the heavier the air felt. I could hear faint laughter through the glass, sharp and practiced. When I reached the front door, I slid the envelope through the mail slot. It landed softly on the hardwood floor inside. I turned to leave, but the door opened behind me. Olivia, Rachel's voice was sharp, disbelieving. She stood in the doorway in a red velvet dress, her hair perfectly curled, her eyes glittering with something between anger and panic. "What are you doing here?" she hissed. I met her gaze evenly. "Just delivering something that belongs to me." Her eyes darted to the envelope on the floor. "You can't just show up like this. You've already done enough damage." I smiled. "No, Rachel. You did that all by yourself." Before she could respond, Mom appeared behind her. "Olivia, stop this nonsense right now. You're ruining Christmas." I tilted my head. Maybe it's time someone ruined the performance. Mom's eyes flashed. "You've always been jealous of Rachel, of our family, of anyone who doesn't live in that lonely apartment of yours." I laughed softly. "You mean the apartment I pay for myself, the one that's mine?" "Yeah, I'll live with that." Rachel folded her arms. You think this makes you look strong? You're embarrassing yourself. I took a step closer. No, I'm exposing you. There's a difference. Behind them, I saw Dad watching from the living room, his expression unreadable. For once, he didn't speak up. He just looked tired, like a man realizing too late that silence has consequences. I turned to go, but before I reached the steps, Mom's voice followed me. You'll regret this, Olivia. You can't destroy your family and walk away like it's nothing. I looked back over my shoulder. I'm not destroying anything, Mom. I'm just refusing to pretend what's already broken still works. When I got back to the car, Marcus had the engine running. He didn't ask what happened. He just reached over and brushed the snow off my coat. You're shaking, he said. I'm fine, I said, though my voice trembled. It's just cold. As we drove away, I glanced in the mirror. Through the rear window, I saw the front door still open. Rachel standing there, her mother beside her, both of them staring down at the envelope like it might explode. When we reached the main road, Marcus said quietly, You think they'll open it tonight? Oh, they'll open it, I said. They won't be able to resist. And when they do, they'll realize Grandma's handwriting wasn't just her will, it was her final word. Back home, I lit the fireplace and poured 2 glasses of wine. Marcus sat beside me, the soft crackle of the fire filling the silence. So he said, What happens next? I leaned back, letting the warmth sink in. Whatever they decide to do, they can't undo the truth. It's public now. It's filed. The house is mine. He smiled. You sound like her when you say that. Like Grandma, he nodded. Like someone who's finally free. I watched the flames dance, thinking of the lake house, of the laughter that would soon die in its walls, of Grandma Helen's words, echoing in my mind. If they ever try to erase, you remind them you were written in ink, not pencil. The clock on the mantel ticked softly. Outside, snow began to fall again, slow and deliberate, blanketing the city in white. I raised my glass and whispered, Merry Christmas, Grandma. We did it. And for the first time in years, the peace that filled me wasn't fragile, it was earned. The first call came at 9:17 that night. I let it ring until it stopped. Then it rang again. Then again. My mother's name flashed across the screen like a warning light. Marcus glanced up from the couch where he was reading the paper and raised an eyebrow. They opened it, he said. I didn't answer. I picked up the phone, stared at it, and set it back down on the coffee table. It started ringing again. I let it go to voicemail this time. A few seconds later, the first message arrived. How could you do this, Olivia? How dare you send legal documents to your family on Christmas Eve? Another followed right after from Rachel. You've completely lost it. Do you realize what you've done to Mom? I opened a bottle of red wine, poured 2 glasses, and handed one to Marcus. Cheers, I said quietly. He clinked his glass against mine. To honesty, he said. The phone buzzed again. I ignored it. We sat in silence for a while, watching the fire crackle. I thought maybe they'd tire themselves out, but then my screen lit up with a flood of new messages. Dad, you need to call us right now. Mom, the entire family is talking about this. You've humiliated us. Rachel, you're going to regret this. You've ruined everything. I scrolled through them, slowly taking my time, as if they were letters from a stranger. And maybe they were. Marcus leaned over to look. They're spiraling, he said. They always spiral when they lose control, I replied. He smiled. And what are you going to do? I sipped my wine. Nothing. The truth doesn't need defending. For a moment we just sat there in the soft light of the fire. Then I reached for my phone, opened the family group chat, and typed one line, Merry Christmas, everyone. Grandma's handwriting was always beautiful. Wasn't it? I pressed send and set the phone down again. The silence that followed was almost cinematic. For 10 long minutes, nothing happened. Then, one by one, the red receipts appeared. Seen by Mom. Seen by Rachel. Seen by Dad. Another message popped up, Rachel. Of course. You're sick, Liv. You think this makes you righteous. You're just jealous. I got the life you couldn't handle. I typed back slowly. You got the life Grandma didn't want you to have. That's not jealousy, Rachel. That's karma. There was a long pause. Then she sent an emoji, a laughing face. That stupid laughing face again, the same one she'd used when she told me not to come. Marcus glanced over and saw it. She's still laughing, I nodded. Let her. People like Rachel only laugh when they're cornered. My phone rang again, this time it was Dad. I hesitated, then picked up. Olivia, he said, his voice low and strained. What the hell are you thinking, hi Dad? Merry Christmas. Don't do that, he snapped. Don't act smug. Your mother's in tears. Rachel's devastated. She's not devastated, Dad, I said calmly. She's exposed. There's a difference. You're tearing this family apart. No, I said softly. You did that the moment you signed off on fraud. He was quiet for a long moment. I could hear the faint murmur of voices behind him, Rachel's high-pitched frustration, Mom's sharp hiss of denial. Then he said quietly, You don't understand how complicated it was. Your mother thought she was protecting everyone. By stealing from me, he sighed. We thought you'd moved on. You have your own life. I let out a small, humorless laugh. You mean the life I built without your help? The life where I work for everything I have while Rachel gets rewarded for lying, Olivia. I cut him off. Dad, I'm done listening. I spent years letting you all tell me who I was. Tonight you get to sit in the truth and feel it. He said nothing. Just a long, quiet exhale before the line went dead. Marcus poured me another glass of wine. You're shaking, he said gently. I looked down at my hands. I think it's adrenaline. He nodded. Adrenaline's just power finding its voice. I smiled faintly. Then I guess I'm finally speaking. Outside, the snow was still falling heavier now, the flakes drifting in slow, steady spirals. The whole city looked like it had been dusted in silence. Inside, though, the tension was loud, alive, vibrating between my phone and my heart. At 9:45, a new message appeared in the group chat. This time, it wasn't from Rachel or Mom, it was from Dad. Your grandmother's will is fake. We'll have it reviewed by our lawyer tomorrow. This ends now. I stared at the message and almost laughed. They were scrambling, trying to rewrite reality again. I typed back. You can have it reviewed by whoever you want. The state already verified it. It's public record now. A few seconds later, Mom responded, How could you embarrass us like this in front of everyone? I stared at her message for a long time, then typed back. You taught me to care about appearances, Mom. I just finally decided to show what they really look like. I hit send, then turned my phone face down. I didn't need to see what came next. We sat in front of the fire until nearly midnight. The flames burned low, the air thick with the smell of smoke and pine. Marcus reached over and brushed a piece of ash from my sleeve. You okay? He asked softly. I thought I'd feel more, I said. Anger. Satisfaction. Something. But it's just quiet. That's what truth feels like when it lands, he said. It doesn't explode. It settles. I nodded. Then it's finally settled. We went to bed just after midnight, but I couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet, the kind of silence that buzzes in your ears. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, until my phone buzzed again. One last message. I hesitated before picking it up. It was from an unknown number. You think you've won, but this isn't over. No signature. But I didn't need one. I knew Rachel's tone anywhere. I stared at the words until the letters blurred, then typed back. You're right, it's not over. But for once, I'm the one writing the ending. I powered off my phone and slid it under the pillow. When I finally drifted to sleep, I dreamed of the lake again. But this time the house wasn't cold or empty. It was warm. The lights inside flickered softly, and Grandma was sitting by the window, her hair silver in the moonlight. You did good, sweetheart, she said. You finally made them see you. I smiled in the dream, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was home. The morning after Christmas felt hollow. The The city was quiet, blanketed in snow, the kind that softens every sound, until even your own footsteps seem too loud. I made coffee, but it tasted bitter no matter how much sugar I added. Marcus was still asleep. I didn't want to wake him. My phone sat face down on the counter, but I could feel it buzzing. I didn't need to look to know it was them. My family had spent the night unraveling, and I had no intention of catching the threads as they fell apart. I poured another cup of coffee and stared out the window. Somewhere out there, my parents and sister were sitting in a house that wasn't theirs, surrounded by proof that it never should have been. At 8:30, my email pinged. It was from Sarah, filed successfully. County clerk has confirmed legal ownership transfer. Congratulations, Olivia. The house is officially yours. I read it 3 times before I could breathe. My name, my house, my grandmother's legacy, mine again. I whispered it out loud like a prayer. It's mine. Marcus appeared in the doorway, still groggy. What's yours? The house, I said. It's done. It's really done. He smiled, the kind that reached his eyes. Then that's the first good Christmas morning you've had in years. I handed him the phone, letting him read the email himself. Watching his face light up was the only thing that made the whole nightmare feel real. He poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter. So what happens now? Now, I said, they face the fallout. By mid-morning it started. Mom called first. I didn't answer, but she left a voicemail anyway. Her voice shook between fury and fear. Olivia, you don't understand what you've done. Your father and I could lose everything. The neighbors are asking questions. Rachel's crying. Just call me back before this goes any further. I deleted it without listening to the end. Then came a text from Rachel. Congratulations. Hope you're happy ruining Christmas for everyone. Guess you'll be decorating your precious lake house alone. I ignored that one too. But when Dad texted, I hesitated. Your mother's not well. She's been crying all night. You made your point, Liv. Enough is enough. For a moment, guilt pricked at me. Then I remembered how easily they'd erased me for years, how many times I'd cried alone while they played happy family without me. I typed back. Enough was 2 years ago when you let her forge Grandma's will. No reply. Sarah called that afternoon. They're already trying to contact the clerk's office, she said. But it won't matter. The verification is airtight. Will there be an investigation, I asked. There already is, she said. The county's fraud division wants to review the forged documents. If they confirm your mother's involvement, there could be charges. My stomach flipped. Charges? As in criminal? Yes, Sarah said gently. Forgery is a felony, Olivia. Even if the court decides not to prosecute, she'll face civil penalties. I leaned against the counter, my pulse steady. I wasn't sure if I felt relief or nausea. I never wanted her in handcuffs, I said quietly. I just wanted the truth. I know, Sarah said. But sometimes the truth has consequences. By evening, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Extended relatives, old family friends, even neighbors from my parents' neighborhood, they all wanted a statement. Apparently word had spread. Rachel's perfect image, Mom's spotless reputation, it was all cracking. And once those cracks appeared, people didn't hesitate to look inside. Marcus and I spent the night on the couch, watching an old movie, trying to drown out the noise. Every few minutes, another notification would light up my screen. At one point, Marcus took my phone and set it face down. You don't have to keep checking, he said. I know, I said. I just can't believe it's really happening. He brushed his thumb along my knuckles. You didn't start this, Liv. You just stopped pretending. The next day, Sarah called again. The county investigator wants to meet with you tomorrow, she said. They'll need your statement and copies of all correspondence. Do I need a lawyer present? I'll be there, she said. Don't worry. Just tell the truth. When I hung up, Marcus was looking at me. You, okay, yeah, I said. Just tired. He nodded. You've been fighting this battle for years without knowing it. You can rest now. But rest didn't come easy. That night, I dreamt I was standing in the lake house. The walls were covered with photos, family portraits, smiling faces, perfectly staged moments, but every photo had my face torn out. I woke with my heart pounding, the taste of salt on my tongue. The next morning, I met with Detective Hall from the county's fraud division. He was polite but direct, the kind of man who didn't waste words. Sarah sat beside me, her notepad open. "We've reviewed the documents," he said. "The signatures don't match. The executor's authorization stamp was altered. We believe your mother and sister worked together to fabricate the new will and push the transfer through." My stomach twisted. "So it's real. They really did it." "Yes," he said simply. "We'll be interviewing them this week. You may be called to testify if this goes to court." I nodded slowly. "I'll be there." When the meeting ended, Sarah squeezed my shoulder. "You handled that perfectly." But on the drive home, the weight of it hit me. My own mother, my sister, could actually be charged with fraud. The little girl inside me still wanted to believe they were good people who made bad choices. But that little girl had been wrong before. At home, Marcus was waiting with takeout and a bottle of wine. "You did it," he said. "I told the truth," I said. "Now the system gets to decide what happens next." He nodded. "You okay with that?" I looked out the window. Snow was falling again, soft and quiet, covering everything in sight. "Yeah," I said, "because for once, it's not my responsibility to protect them." A few days later, Sarah called again. "It's official," she said. "The county has filed a notice of intent to pursue criminal charges against Margaret Matthews for forgery and estate fraud." I sat down slowly. "Mom's really going to court. She may settle," Sarah said. "But yes, this will follow her." After I hung up, I sat in silence for a long time. I thought about Grandma Helen and the lessons she'd tried to teach me about fairness, honesty, and the weight of one's name. And I thought about my mother, the woman who'd spent her whole life caring more about image than truth, now about to be defined by the very thing she'd tried to hide. That night, I stood by the window with Marcus. The city lights shimmered below us, and somewhere in the distance a car horn echoed faintly. "I thought winning would feel better," I said quietly. "It's not about winning," he said. "It's about ending the story they kept writing for you." I nodded. "Then I guess it's over." He shook his head. "No, it's just changing authors." Outside, the snow began to fall harder, blanketing the city in white. I leaned into him, the sound of his heartbeat steady against my ear. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like absence. It felt like peace. When I closed my eyes, I could almost hear Grandma's voice again. "Truth doesn't destroy, families live," she whispered in my memory. "Lies do." And for the first time, I knew she was right. The courthouse smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. I'd been there for less than 10 minutes, but my palms were already damp. The echo of footsteps down the marble hallway reminded me of the nights I used to sneak into Grandma's study after dinner, trying not to make noise, trying not to be seen. It felt poetic that I was here now, about to watch the truth I'd uncovered finally step into daylight. Sarah walked beside me, crisp and composed as ever. "Just remember," she said softly, "you don't have to say anything today. This is just an initial hearing. They'll enter pleas and we'll get the next date on the calendar." I nodded, but my throat was dry. "Do you think they'll show up?" "They have to," she said. "If they don't, there's a warrant." I'd barely sat down when the doors opened behind me. The sound hit me like static. I didn't need to turn around. I already knew that perfume. Mom's scent had been the same since I was 5, gardenia and control. When she walked past me, she didn't look my way. Rachel followed her heels, clicking like punctuation marks on tile. Her hair was pulled too tight, her face pale beneath a coat of makeup. They took seats at the defense table. Dad wasn't there. Maybe he couldn't handle it. Or maybe he was smart enough to know this was one storm he couldn't stop. The judge entered, and everyone stood. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my jaw. The proceedings were short, barely 20 minutes. The charges were read: estate fraud, forgery, falsification of legal documents. When the clerk asked for a plea, my mother's voice shook slightly as she said, "Not guilty." Rachel echoed the same words, but her tone was colder, mechanical. When the judge asked if there were any immediate motions, their attorney stood. Your Honor, my clients are deeply distressed by these false accusations. This entire matter stems from a family dispute fueled by bitterness and misunderstanding. We request leniency and mediation, not prosecution. Sarah rose from beside me. Your Honor, the evidence is extensive and verified by the state. The complainant, my client, didn't act out of vengeance. She acted to restore a rightful inheritance stolen from her by deception. Her voice didn't tremble once. Watching her speak, I realized how much strength it took to stay calm in front of people who had spent years trying to convince you your truth didn't exist. The judge glanced between both tables, then finally said, "We'll set a date for the evidentiary hearing. Until then, both defendants are ordered to refrain from any contact with the complainant." I exhaled so quietly that it felt like air leaking from a wound. When the gavel came down, the sound was final and merciful. Afterward, I stood in the hallway waiting for Sarah to gather her things. The air felt thick. When I turned, Rachel was watching me. She took a few steps closer, ignoring her mother's hissed warning. "You think this makes you the hero, don't you?" she said under her breath. I looked at her, really looked at her. Her eyes were wild, rimmed red from lack of sleep, her voice vibrating with anger that came from fear. "No," I said. "I'm not the hero. I'm just the one who stopped pretending." Her jaw tightened. "You've destroyed everything. Then maybe it wasn't worth keeping." For a second, she looked like she might cry. Then she turned sharply and walked away. Mom followed, head held high, her heels clicking like a metronome for pride. When they disappeared through the glass doors, I felt something break loose inside me. Not triumph, not relief, something quieter, like breathing after years underwater. Sarah joined me by the window. "You did good," she said. "I didn't do anything. You showed up," she said. "Sometimes that's everything." Outside, the sky was gray, but the snow had stopped. A thin ribbon of sunlight cut through the clouds, glinting off the courthouse steps. That afternoon, I drove straight to the lake house. The road was clear now, and the snow along the shoulders glittered like frost glass. When I pulled into the driveway, it hit me how different the house looked in daylight. It wasn't a fortress anymore, just wood and stone and memory. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. I half expected to feel rage or triumph, but what I felt was something stranger, peace. I walked through the rooms slowly, letting my fingers brush across familiar surfaces. The mantel where Grandma's old clock used to sit, the bay window where she used to read, the kitchen island where she'd taught me to roll out pie dough one snowy afternoon when I was 12. Every corner whispered something I'd forgotten. In the study, I found the letter she'd written to me years ago, still framed on the desk. "Family will either sharpen you or dull you, Olivia. Don't let them file you down to silence." I ran my fingers over her words, tracing the loops of her pen. When Marcus arrived later that evening, he found me sitting by the window, a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. He didn't say anything at first, just stood behind me, his reflection soft in the glass. "They pled not guilty," I said quietly. He nodded. "Of course they did. Part of me thought they'd apologize," I admitted. "People like that don't apologize," he said gently. "They rewrite." I smiled faintly. Not this time. He poured us each a cup of coffee from the thermos he'd brought and joined me on the window seat. Outside, the lake was frozen over a pale mirror, catching the last light of day. "So what now?" he asked. "I rebuild," I said. "Not the house. Me." He nodded. "Then you're exactly where you're supposed to be." We sat there until the sky turned violet and the stars began to appear. I thought of Grandma again, how she used to say winter wasn't an ending, it was a pause. A chance to rest before spring. That night I slept in the house for the first time in years. No ghosts, no whispers, just the sound of wind against the glass and the steady rhythm of my own breathing. When morning came, I made pancakes the way Grandma used to, too much butter, not enough sugar, and opened the windows wide. Cold air flooded the kitchen, sharp and clean. While I ate, my phone buzzed. It was an email from Sarah. Preliminary hearing confirmed for February 12. They're asking about restitution. We'll discuss terms next week. I closed the email and looked around the kitchen. For the first time, the house felt alive again. Not haunted, not stolen, mine. Later that day, I took a walk around the property. The trees were heavy with snow bending slightly under the weight. I stopped by the dock, brushing off the frost from the railing. For years, I'd been so focused on surviving my family that I'd forgotten what it felt like to exist without fear. Standing there in the stillness, I realized something simple but profound: they no longer had power over me. They could plead, they could twist, they could shout, but the truth didn't bend anymore. When I came back inside, Marcus had started a fire. He looked up and smiled. "You look lighter." "I am," I said. "Maybe it's the air," he laughed softly, "or maybe it's finally letting go." I sank onto the couch beside him, watching the flames. Grandma used to say, "Truth doesn't scream, it hums." Quiet, steady like a heartbeat. He reached for my hand. "Then you've got your rhythm back." I smiled. "Yeah," I said softly. "I think I have." The fire crackled, the light flickering across the room. Outside, snow started falling again, slow, soft, endless, and for the first time it didn't feel like a storm, it felt like grace. By the time February came, the air in Denver carried that strange in-between chill, when winter hadn't quite left, but spring was impatient to arrive. The lake had begun to thaw, and each morning I woke to the sound of ice cracking somewhere deep beneath the surface, like the world itself was exhaling after holding its breath too long. The hearing was set for the 12th. I didn't expect them to show up looking broken. I'd learned long ago that my mother and sister didn't know how to look anything but composed. When I entered the courthouse that morning, I spotted them immediately. Mom in a navy blazer, pearls at her throat like armor. Rachel beside her in black, jaw clenched, her eyes glassy from either lack of sleep or too much denial. They didn't look at me. They didn't have to. The distance between us was a language all its own. Sarah guided me to my seat at the plaintiff's table. "You don't need to say much," she whispered. "Just let the facts speak." When the judge entered, I felt the air shift. The proceedings began like clockwork: introductions, summaries, evidence submissions. The clerk read the verified documents aloud. The will, the signature comparison, the transfer files, each stamped and sealed. Every word felt like a nail being gently, methodically hammered into the coffin of their version of reality. At one point, the judge asked if I wished to make a statement before deliberations. I hadn't planned to, but something inside me stirred. I stood, my knees trembling, but my voice steady. For 8 years I believed family meant unconditional loyalty. I spent my adult life giving more than I could afford to keep the peace, to earn affection that was always conditional. When I discovered what had been done to my grandmother's will, I thought I'd lose everything again. Instead, I found myself. The courtroom was silent. My mother's eyes flickered, but she didn't look up. Rachel stared at the table. "I don't want revenge," I said. "I want restoration. Of my grandmother's legacy. Of my name. Of my right to live without being treated like someone's resource. I didn't destroy this family. I just stopped being the glue that kept their lives together." When I sat down, Sarah gave me a small nod. "Perfect," she murmured. The judge adjourned briefly to review the filings. When she returned, she read her decision aloud, measured, deliberate, and final. "The court finds sufficient evidence to confirm the authenticity of the original will and proof of intentional forgery in the subsequent version. The estate of Helen Matthews will remain with the lawful beneficiary, Olivia Matthews. Restitution will be ordered for damages incurred by the fraudulent filing." I exhaled slowly, hands trembling in my lap. I wasn't sure if it was relief or something heavier: grief. Maybe for everything it had taken to reach this point. Mom stood immediately, whispering harshly to her attorney. Rachel looked at me for the first time, her face drained of color. For a brief second, I saw something that looked like regret flash across her eyes, but it vanished as quickly as it came. As I left, the courthouse sunlight hit the steps just right, bouncing off the ice and scattering across the pavement like shattered glass. Sarah walked beside me, heels clicking confidently. "It's over," she said. I shook my head. "No," I said softly. "It's beginning." Back at the lake house, the wind coming off the water was cold but clean, the kind of air that stings your lungs before it makes you feel alive. Marcus met me on the porch, arms open. "So," he asked. I smiled for the first time in weeks. "It's done." "The judge ruled in my favor," he grinned. "Then it's really yours." "It's really mine," I echoed, and hearing it aloud made me laugh. A soft, startled laugh that turned into tears before I could stop them. Marcus pulled me close, holding me until my shaking turned into breathing again. That night, we lit a fire and toasted with the cheap champagne we'd been saving since New Year's. "To truth," he said, raising his glass. "To freedom," I said, clinking mine against his. The following week, I met with Maria Santos from the Denver Rescue Mission. She'd reached out again after seeing my story online. "Your post went viral, you know," she said. "Hundreds of women shared its stories about financial abuse, manipulation, toxic families. You gave them language for what they couldn't name." Her words hit me harder than the verdict had. I hadn't realized how many people were living quieter versions of my nightmare. Maria leaned forward. "We'd love for you to help us launch an initiative, financial literacy and emotional recovery programs for women rebuilding after family exploitation. We're calling it Helen's Promise." For a moment I couldn't speak. I looked out the window at the city, at the frozen skyline slowly thawing under the late winter Sunday. "She'd love that," I said finally. "Count me in." By March, the campaign had taken shape. Mile High Marketing Solutions, my firm, signed on as a sponsor. Jessica and Anthony offered to handle design and outreach. What started as a story of loss was becoming something bigger, something that mattered. When the program launched, local news covered it. They showed footage of me standing at a podium, speaking about boundaries, financial independence, and the quiet kind of revenge that comes from living well. Behind me was a banner that read "Helen's Promise, from pain to power." It kept my speech short. "We can't always choose the family we're born into," I told the audience, "but we can choose the family we build. The kind that doesn't ask you to shrink to be loved. The kind that claps when you finally stand tall." Applause filled the room, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was performing. I felt like I was home. After the event, Marcus found me backstage grinning. "You know, I think Helen would have been proud." I smiled. "I hope so. She taught me that truth doesn't always come wrapped in comfort. It comes with cost. But it's worth paying." He reached for my hand. "So what now?" I said. "I build something worth inheriting." In the months that followed, the lake house transformed. We repainted the kitchen, replaced the curtains, opened windows that hadn't been opened in years. I planted wildflowers along the path, leading down to the dock, the same kind Grandma used to grow. By summer, the yard was alive again, buzzing with color and light. On a warm June evening, I sat on the porch steps watching the sunset bleed into the water. Rachel had sent one final letter months earlier, a short, hollow apology that didn't ask for forgiveness. I'd never responded. Some doors were better left closed. But sometimes when the wind shifted just right, I could almost hear Grandma's voice in the rustle of the trees. "You did good, sweetheart. You broke the cycle." I closed my eyes, letting the words settle. She'd been right all along. Family wasn't who shared your blood. It was who showed up when the truth did. Marcus joined me on the steps, his arm around my shoulders. "Hard to believe it's been a year," he said. "Yeah," I whispered. 1 year since everything fell apart, and somehow everything finally came together. We sat in silence for a while, watching the water shimmer. Somewhere across the lake, a church bell rang, soft, distant, familiar. As twilight deepened, I thought of every woman who'd written to me since that post. strangers who had become sisters in truth, survivors who had found their voices. This story had started with a text telling me not to come. 3 days before Christmas, they tried to erase me. But tonight, under a lavender sky, I knew something simple and unshakable. No one could erase someone who had rewritten her own ending. I turned to Marcus and smiled. "You ready to make this house a home?" He kissed my forehead. "It already is." As the stars began to appear, I whispered the words that had become my quiet prayer, my own kind of CTA, to anyone still watching, still listening, still afraid to stand up for themselves. If you've ever been silenced by people who were supposed to love you, don't wait for their permission to speak. Tell your story. Choose your peace. And if this one resonated with you, share it. Someone out there needs to know they're not alone. The wind stirred through the trees, carrying the faint scent of pine and lake water. I leaned into the quiet, feeling Grandma's presence in every breath. The truth hadn't just set me free, it had built something new, something beautiful, and this time it was mine.